Hello, I'm BJ Rudell with Polis, Center for Politics at Duke University, part of the Sanford School of Public Policy. Our special guest today is Dr. Chris Cooper. Dr. Cooper is a professor and head of the Department of Political Science and Public Affairs at Western Carolina University. In 2013, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching named him North Carolina's Professor of the Year. He also provides expert commentary on matters involving politics and political science in and beyond North Carolina. And additionally, he frequently shares political insights across media platforms. Dr. Cooper, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You've written, among many of your terrific writings, that North Carolina will be among the states that matters most in 2020. Why did you write that?
Yeah, so to backtrack a little bit, obviously we're talking after the primary, but it's worth noting that last round, about a third of the electors had already been cast by the time we voted in the first place, right? This round, it was about 4%. So even in the primary, North Carolina mattered a lot more this round. As far as the general, I think a lot has been made about North Carolina in 2008, voting for Obama, of course, and for Republicans in the election since. But we've actually gotten closer to the median state in terms of vote share. So I think we sometimes read too much into that blue to red or red to blue to red flip that happened before and after 2008. We're actually looking more and more like the average state. I think our measures of public opinion put us really smack in the middle of the country. Political scientists come up with all these measures. Pick one, it doesn't really matter. We're about in the middle of the country. If you look at our party registration, we can talk later about unaffiliated voters and how that's been increasing, but neither party has a huge advantage. So kind of no matter what metric you look at, North Carolina looks like a fairly average state, a swing state, a purple state. And if you add to that, there's not a lot of swing states in the country, right? We know how California's going to go. I don't care who ends up being the Democratic nominee. It'll be Biden. But, and we know how Wyoming's going to go. So there's maybe 10 to 13 states that matter. And North Carolina is one of the largest of those states. And to put one more wrinkle on top of it, with the new census, we're going to gain a member of Congress. We're going to gain an elector. Michigan will lose. So compared to other swing states, we're actually going to become more influential as time goes on.
That's right. I think we're going to crack maybe the top 8 after this in terms of size, which is pretty incredible, especially for those of us like me who grew up outside of North Carolina, didn't appreciate the growth. Speaking of swing state, you wrote about swing counties. You wrote about this in the Asheville Citizen-Times, and that of the state's 100 counties, only 4 split their support in 2016 between President Trump, eventual President Trump, and eventual Democratic Governor Roy Cooper. So what do you think swing counties can tell us about what might happen in 2020?
Yeah, I think they can tell us a lot. So again, this notion of swing states, I think everybody follows and thinks about, but there's of course tremendous variation within states. So North Carolina, we got 100 counties. 4 of them, as you said, split between Cooper and Trump, right? So we had this incredibly razor thin margin in the last round in our gubernatorial election and a pretty close one in the presidential. So those 4 counties, I think, are really interesting counties to look at, right? So that's Granville, Jackson, Nash, and New Hanover counties if you're keeping score at home. There's a couple of other ways to think about swing counties too. That's the one I like, but you can look at ones that flipped from 2012 to 2016. So that'll add a few to you. Bladen, Gates, Martin, Richmond, and Robeson counties get added to that list. But no matter how you slice it, there's at most about 10 counties where I think we don't know what's going to happen. So what I think this means is if you're trying to understand where North Carolina is going, and if you're trying to understand where to campaign, you may not want to spend all your time in Buncombe and in Meck and in Wake counties. You may want to look at some of these swing counties.
Well, then that's a question I was going to ask you about. What would you advise the presidential campaigns, the Republican and the Democratic, if you were their top advisor? Would you approach North Carolina geographically in that way with counties, or message? Does message rule the day?
Yeah, I think the message has to play differently in different places. And some of it is obviously those counties, but also there's a clear urban-rural divide in this state. I think that's one of the few things that both Democrats and Republicans agree on in North Carolina. And so the way that you're going to message in the majority counties, which are rural in this state, versus the populous counties, the urban counties, has to be different. I also think presidential campaigns that come in here have got to pay attention to the unaffiliated vote. Political scientists like to kind of poo-poo this and say, oh, these are just shadow partisans that already kind of know what they think. But I think this is a trend worth paying attention to. So in September 2017, unaffiliated took over Republican as the second largest group in North Carolina politics. By 2022, it will be the largest group in North Carolina politics. And there's 16 counties where it's already the largest group in North Carolina politics. So if you are running for office, any office, you've got to pay attention to these unaffiliated voters and what they're doing. Fortunately, those data are pretty easy to come by in the state of North Carolina, but I think they need to watch those. The parties in general, I guess my sort of third point on this would be just thinking through party building in a purple state. And I think both parties actually deserve some credit for doing a good job of this. In 2016, about 46% of our state legislative seats were unopposed. So about half the time you knew who was going to win before we even have an election. In 2018 and in 2020, both parties did a great job running people for office, right? The main thing that parties do. So I think both parties are building a more robust farm team, and that's going to help out any presidential candidate or anybody down ballot.
Now, you've mentioned unaffiliated twice in your answer. So now I'm going to back up and ask you a pretty pointed question. What is it, if you could name one thing, what quality unifies a majority of unaffiliated voters? What are they looking for? What are they angry about? What do they think about when they get up in the morning?
Yeah, things other than politics, I think a lot of them. And I think that's an important thing to remember, right? And so the avenue, people say sometimes, why does this matter? And the avenues in which we contact folks is through parties. And so here is a whole lot of people who aren't getting those party messages as regularly, which is why I think that they're important. They tend to be younger by a good bit. They racially are somewhere in between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. They are more diverse in the Republican Party racially. They're less diverse than the Democratic Party racially. And again, young people, I think, is a big key. So if you go and look at some of these early voting sites, even in our last primary, that were on college campuses, unaffiliated just beat both parties to death. That's where the turnout was. And so I think these are young people who are trying to signal, you know what, I like politics, I'm involved, but it's not everything, and I want something slightly different, even if they're still voting for one of the two parties.
Shifting now directly to the presidency and the upcoming convention, if it will happen, as many hope it will, but we don't know because of coronavirus, but the convention in Charlotte for the Republican Party. If it becomes a virtual event where people are not in the arena, but instead some other social distancing convention takes shape, will that hamper the Republicans' ability at all for capitalizing on having their convention in the state?
Yeah, I love this question. So normally, right, you ask a political scientist a question, what do they do? They think about, well, all this other research that we've done on similar phenomenon and pandemic-induced convention cancellation. We don't have a lot of good data on that. So, so it's hard to know. But we know that in general, conventions do tend to help the party that holds them. They tend to increase not only turnout amongst that group by a little bit, but just knowledge of the candidates. This makes sense, right? You're saturating the local media with one party much more than the other party. And so my guess would be that effect would be tamped down a little bit if it was a virtual convention. I just think it's not going to be quite as newsworthy. I think the local folks are not going to be obviously employed as much, which is a big driver in this. So I would expect some effect, but not nearly as much of an effect as we would normally see.
And what about in general, do you think coronavirus, I know it's impossible to predict, as you alluded to, but if we're in a situation where remote voting is taking place in the fall because people are just not getting out, not going to polls, not congregating in any way. In a state like North Carolina, do you feel that benefits one party or another?
It's a great question. Something I would expect, we're going to see, of course, a ramp up of vote by mail. And I know you've been talking to some other folks about that, so I won't hit on that too much. I think it may benefit the party that is able to change their playbook quickly. And it's kind of a strange answer, I realize, but I think right now we don't know which party is going to change. Look, politics is still about retail politics, right? It's still about pressing the flesh in the most literal sense of that term. We use all these data to say, which flesh do we press, to say, how do we do it? Do we say how we message people? But it's still about face-to-face contact. That's what tends to increase turnout. When that's not possible, I think both parties are going to have to adapt really quickly. And I'm frankly a little surprised that we haven't seen more of that already. And I'll give you a good example. In the 11th Congressional District, we have a runoff right now going on the Republican side. Linda Bennett and Madison Cawthorn. We can talk more about that if you'd like. But both candidates have been pretty quiet. I'm surprised they're not doing more virtual town halls. I'm surprised they're not trying to mimic the kind of retail politics that we tend to see work. So I don't know that it's a D advantage or it's an R advantage. I think it is a time where campaign strategy may matter more.
It reminds me a little bit maybe of 2008 when John McCain suspended his presidential campaign in the face of the economic meltdown. Kind of the question of, is it bad form to politic during a national crisis? And do you think that plays in at all with what's happening in the 11th Congressional District? Is it a case of no one wants to look like they're too eager to win when people are suffering? Or is that naive of me to phrase it that way?
No, I don't think it's naive at all. I think that's accurate. I think people are scared. I think both candidates are probably scared. I also think it's hard to drive media coverage right now. So in their defense, they may be trying, but local media in the West are covering coronavirus, just like they're covering everywhere else. So if you turn on WLOS, which is our only TV station out here, or you read the Asheville Citizen Times, or listen to Blue Ridge Public Radio, every story is about coronavirus. So they may be having trouble just breaking through the noise of coronavirus for very understandable reasons.
I've noticed that North Carolina's numbers, partly it seems due to the quick actions that the state took to create social distancing relative to many other southern states, that North Carolina has relatively low cases per million population, deaths per million population, the type of metrics that show that perhaps it's working better in North Carolina than in many other states. At the risk of politicizing that, but we are in a political season, do you feel that that's something that might have an impact in November for one party or another, or essentially keeping people safe? Does Trump get more of a boon than Cooper? Is it possible to answer that question at this point?
I think we've got some tea leaves we can try to read. So polling data, we can cite sort of two ideologically disparate polls, right? So Civitas had something come out last week, I believe. Public policy polling had something come out within a couple of days. Public policy polling tends to lean a little left. Civitas tends to lean a little right. And what they both showed actually was a fair bit of similarity in that Trump and Cooper seem to be benefiting a little bit from coronavirus in North Carolina. My guess is because our rates of infection tend to be lower, there is kind of an incumbency halo effect, which may be slightly less dependent on party and more dependent on just who's in office. So if things are going good, you're going to give a little bit of credit to Cooper. You're going to give a little bit of credit to Trump. And so that's been really interesting to me. And the way that's played on Cooper's numbers in particular going forward is striking. So there's a substantial proportion, maybe about 13% in both polls, of folks who are supporting Trump, say, I'm voting for Donald Trump, who also say, I'm voting for Roy Cooper. That does not work in the opposite direction. So I think I think there's some incumbency effect here that's going to be important.
That's fascinating. I want to ask you one more question, just getting back to that 11th district, which used to be Mark Meadows, as you know full well. But just for people who might be watching at home and not be aware, Mark Meadows, now the chief of staff to President Trump and one of the leaders of the Freedom Caucus in the House of Representatives. The district changed a little bit when gerrymandering was struck down in congressional districts and some more left-leaning parts of Western North Carolina were added to it. And so my question is it pretty much in the bag that one of the two runoff candidates on the Republican side will be the next congressperson from that district? Or do Democrats, do you feel, think they have a shot?
Yeah, I love this question. I think both things are true. I think this is a highly likely Republican district where Democrats think they have a shot. And so just a smidge more background here. So the 11th in the way we were represented by a guy named Heath Schuler, who was a Democrat. It was the most competitive district in the state. The lines are redrawn, and they took Asheville essentially and put it in the 10th congressional district. This is a while back, right at Louisiana Avenue in West Asheville, if you're trying to find your map. And that made it the most Republican district in the state overnight. All right, so we get Meadows, long, interesting story there. Then the lines are redrawn. Asheville's back in the district, but it's pulled us from being about 63% Trump to about 57% Trump. So this is better for Democrats than it used to be. There's no doubt that is true, but it is still a Republican lean district. A guy named Mo Davis won a crowded field on the Democratic side. And so he's been able to do fairly well in fundraising. And again, he's running against right now, we don't know who. There's two folks who are running in the runoff, the one congressional runoff in North Carolina. It's on the Republican side in the 11th. Madison Cawthorn against Linda Bennett. Linda Bennett is perceived as sort of Meadows' handpicked successor. Madison Cawthorn is this young upstart from Henderson County, and they're going to have a runoff to determine who goes against Mo Davis. So I think Davis feels good that the Republicans have to spend some money, again, running against each other. But in the end, yes, this looks like a Republican district.
And it sounds like when you say 57% Trump district, it sounds like, Trump's poll numbers need to be probably in the 30s before possibly for Democrats to feel that, or objectively to feel that there's a good shot. It seems like, right? You really need to be able to pull a lot of those voters who voted for Trump away from Trump and for Davis.
You would. And I think this is where that unaffiliated piece, just to tie that thread one more time, the West is the region of the state that tends to have the most unaffiliated. So Davis's strategy has got to be, Mo Davis, the Democrat strategy, has to be to get these unaffiliated voters who may be less moored to one party or the other on his side. So yeah, it's got to be about driving down Trump's numbers. And if Bennett is the candidate, which seems like the odds-on favorite, I think tying her to the way that Meadows left the district will clearly be Davis's strategy. And Bennett's strategy then would likely be, she is Mark Meadows' successor. If Cawthorn somehow pulls this out, again, he's a young guy, and I think a lot of his appeal is going to be on the youth side, and he is definitely a staunch conservative. He will be putting that out there as well.
That is a great point about adding more votes from the unaffiliated ranks, because you think about, the state of our country heading into November will be very different than what it was in 2016, and you could see a scenario where if turnout jumps significantly, as it did in 2018 for Democrats, what you're saying, I mean, if it more than compensates for the support that the other party has, that could be the difference. You might, it might not just be about switching votes. It could just be getting a whole lot of more votes from people who haven't voted.
Yep, that's exactly right.
You said it more articulately than I did, so
I doubt that.
I should have left it at that. But it sounds very, very thoughtful. I really appreciate it, Dr. Cooper. Thanks for taking the time to help us understand North Carolina and what's happening in Western North Carolina.
It was a pleasure to talk to you anytime.